In 1 year, I actually got tested 8 times the year before my diagnosis, and they were all negative. So a huge sigh of relief each time, going through the whole process, the anxiety and so forth. And then the ninth HIV test that I had was positive, unfortunately, and I didn't have any symptoms. I wasn't ill, but I knew that as a sexually active gay man, I needed to get tested. And living in the country in the world with the most people with HIV, there was a chance that I would contract it. It was devastating at the time. You're questioning your survival and you're thinking, am I going to survive? How am I going to get through this? And that's really, really tricky. It's really difficult. I think receiving news like that, you're never fully prepared for it. Life has been great in many senses. I've been incredibly healthy. I'm on medication. I'm undetectable, which means that my viral load is very well managed. It's under a certain amount. I can't pass the virus on to anybody else. I've had incredibly supportive family and friends. Since moving to London, I've done quite a bit of activism with organizations such as Stop AIDS, Youth Stop AIDS. And so I've had a really positive journey. I know that for many people living with HIV, the stigma, the discrimination means that they can't be this open about their status. They can't talk about it, not necessarily even on television, but talk about it to their family or to their friends or people close to them. So in that sense, I've been incredibly lucky. There are many countries in the world where HIV positive people can't move to. What's really amazing about London is that there is this network of support, and it is really easy for an HIV positive individual to tap into that network of support. Many people that I meet are totally accepting and they understand it. I find lots of discrimination within the LGBT community. So there are still pockets of discrimination, pockets of stigma, people who don't really understand what being HIV positive means.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Zen and Now. Today, I'm joined by someone truly inspiring, Dr. Krishen Samuel, a PhD researcher, writer, and principal consultant at Equidiverse Synergy, where he's all about building inclusive, equitable, and neurodiverse spaces. But beyond the titles, Krishen brings powerful lived experience through his work. He's an openly gay man living with HIV, and he shows up with honesty, courage, and a deep commitment to creating a real change. This conversation is heart, truth, and wisdom. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for that very kind intro.
No, you're welcome. So, Krishen, before we get into the actual crux of the conversation, just give us, our listeners, just a little bit of an intro into who you are, even though I've given the intro.
Absolutely. No, that's totally fine. I mean, the first thing that I absolutely have to say is that it's bizarre and maybe somewhat serendipitous that our names are exactly the same apart from one letter. So
Exactly.
when I received the invite to be on the show, I was like, oh, I have to do this because his name is so similar to mine.
Yeah, similar to me. I was like, oh, okay, it's not too difficult to pronounce. I just need to add an R to the to the name.
So, it's interesting because whenever somebody says somebody's bio, it always sounds so together, as though it was completely intentional and they followed those steps in a specific order, and that was what they aimed to do. But I think with me, I kind of have found my way through doing different things that have appealed to me at different times, and have been motivating for various different reasons. So, for instance, I'm originally a speech pathologist. And so I had worked in that space for a long time. I had specialized in autism and neurodevelopmental disabilities. I ran a school for kids in autism in Johannesburg, South Africa, and had done that for a really long time. And, that will always be really close to my heart. But then after a while, I thought, well, it might be time for a change. And then I wanted to go into that broader global health space. And I found myself moving to London to do a master's degree in global public health. And from there, it kind of just, once you make that decision to have that career change, and there were personal factors that influenced that as well. So, for instance, living with HIV. And then that kind of just takes on a momentum of its own, and it takes you where you're going to go. And so a few years later, back in South Africa again, and one thing that I'd always wanted to do was to get a Fulbright scholarship and study in the US. And I had applied before a long time ago when I was still doing speech pathology. But then I thought, well, things have changed, so maybe it's time to try and apply again. And eventually, on the third try, I got it. So I was very excited to do my PhD in the US. And yeah, so it's just, I guess, we sometimes find these meandering pathways that lead us to what it is that we'd like to do. And then that's where we find ourselves. So yes, but thank you for the lovely intro.
Oh, you're welcome. So your academic journey spans 3 continents. How has that global exposure shaped your perspective on a public health perspective and just on humanity? Because I believe you probably have seen, different cultures, different societies, and how they perceive these points.
Absolutely. I think there's such a big difference in terms of both looking at things from a global north perspective versus a global south perspective. A high resource setting perspective versus a low resource setting perspective. And, coming from South Africa, it's really interesting because we've got this really fascinating history, having been colonized by both the British and the Dutch, apartheid, this massive clash of cultures that we have in South Africa. And so we're exposed to quite a lot in South Africa, whether that be culture, language, various different aspects. And so in South Africa, I was lucky enough to work in both the public and the private healthcare sector. And that knowledge and that experience was really beneficial for me moving to both the US and the UK, because I found that I could more easily navigate those settings, partly because of the experience that I had in South Africa. But it is always good to just get a perspective change, really, right? Especially in terms of what I do from a health perspective. Because when you're in a high resource setting, you just see that things often work so much more easily just because there's more money involved, right? And so
exactly.
Yeah, and that's really an important point. I think that people don't always understand about how the public health world works and how infrastructure works and so forth. And they tend to think, well, this country does things incorrectly, this country is corrupt, etc. They have many reasons, but oftentimes it just comes really down to something basic like funding. When you're in the high resource settings, you see that things work so much more smoothly, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, simply because there's more money involved. And so then the questions, for me, a big question has been, what is the responsibility of the global north in helping out the global south? What is the role of development and developmental aid and so forth? And these questions have become quite important right now, partly because the US has decided to slash aid funding globally. And so this leaves some countries, especially a country like South Africa, in quite a precarious position, for instance, with our HIV services. And so, but having had that experience, to go back to your original question, in both the global north and global south has given me, it's given me a wealth of kind of perspective, really. Just saying, okay, so this is how things are done here. This is how things are done in a different setting. And it's not about being right or wrong. It's about finding solutions that are tailored to the context. And often that means that you have to take culture into perspective. You have to take racial inequities into perspective, socioeconomic disparities. All of that needs to be taken into perspective, especially when you're looking at something as broad as health.
Yeah. Given that, South Africa, we rely so much on our private sector in terms of services. Like you said, the disparity between the financial gain one gets from a more precocious type of environment, where, like here up in the north, even in Canada, you would get a little bit more funding towards something that's stigmatized in trying to bring that discussion to the norm, or in societies. I know in South Africa it's still a bit stigmatized, and in terms of, we try and ostracize people who are living with these conditions. We don't want to associate ourselves with them, and these are the facts. We don't want to acknowledge or accept that this happens in our homes close to us and to the people that we love. And we kind of take it for granted also, because we feel, I think we don't really expect those things to happen, and when they do, we aren't able to navigate that from an emotional perspective. How do we regulate those feelings, or even for ourselves or somebody that we know? And then it all comes down to also education. How much are we willing to get that to the grassroots level and educate our younger generation not to feel discriminated against if something is happening in their homes, to come openly and honestly to say, hey, look, this is happening. Can I talk about it? This is how I feel. How do I navigate it? And we should also then have those resources in place, which I feel, which you're trying to do, if I stand correct.
Yeah, I will say, to speak to your point about South Africa, I think we've come quite a long way, especially in terms of HIV. I think we've gone through various different phases. We're the country in the world with the biggest HIV epidemic. So that also means we have the biggest treatment rollout program in the world. And I think we've gone through our different phases in terms of the stigmatization of HIV and in terms of acceptance and understanding of it. So, for instance, right at the end of apartheid in 1994, we were dealing with the birth of our new democracy, and we were quite focused on that. And that was a story of positivity, a story of hope, a story of resilience. And unfortunately, those were the years in which HIV was silently growing in the background. But unfortunately, at that time, we weren't really paying so much attention to it because we were really focused on building a new nation. And so the virus really took hold. And that's why towards the end of the 90s, the early 2000s, we started seeing this wave of deaths. And unfortunately, the government firstly, they weren't well prepared to deal with it. But secondly, they weren't willing to deal with it. So we saw denialism. We saw that antiretroviral medications were not available through the public health system. And it was activists, the Treatment Action Campaign and so forth, who had to fight for those medications. But now we're at a very different place, because now, after that rather gloomy start, we got to the point where, with the help of international donors like the US and the UK and various others, we've gotten to the point where actually, having HIV in South Africa now has become commonplace, firstly, because so many people have it, but commonplace also in the sense that it's not quite as stigmatized as I think people may think it is. It has become another chronic condition where you can go and get your meds. You know that if you're living with HIV and you're undetectable, meaning that your viral load is below a certain level, below a certain threshold, you're not able to pass the virus on to sexual partners, even if a condom is not used. So we have a slogan in the HIV world: undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals U, which is exactly what I just explained. So and that campaign in South Africa has really taken off because of activists on the ground, and because of a very strong presence that the activists have, both in medical circles and in scientific circles, and just generally the activists in South Africa have a really strong presence. So I think the epidemic has gone a bit away from the way you were describing it to a place where now I think there's more acceptance, there's more understanding. Does it mean that stigma has gone completely? Absolutely not. So there is still the stigma. And I do think, to your point about young people, a challenge that we've had, this has been more of a global challenge, not just South Africa, is that for many young people, they didn't live through the height of the AIDS crisis, right? So they didn't actually see people dying from AIDS. They might see it in movies, or they might hear about, Freddie Mercury, Rock Hudson, and so forth, but they didn't actually live through that. And so for them, I do think they tend to think of AIDS as a problem of yesteryear. It's something that has been dealt with. It's not something that we have to be afraid of. But unfortunately, there are still people who die of AIDS. If they don't get access to treatment, they do still die of AIDS. So we always have to be really aware of that. It is still an ever-present danger. But if it's managed well, then you can live a long, happy life.
Yeah. I guess it also stems from, like any chronic disease, you could die from it. Diabetes, you could, chronic pain, if you don't take care of it, you could it could end up that way. So I think you said, you made an important point, that we've come along the timeline of now that it's categorized as chronic, and you can get medication, you can get help. So whoever's listening out there, wanting some research, or just wanting to know where to start, I think you can reach out. There are resources out there that actually do give you now the opportunity to go and get your medication and start your journey.
Absolutely. And it's really important to know that I often have people who've just been diagnosed with HIV reach out to me. And, unfortunately, if you don't have the knowledge, then it can still be an incredibly frightful diagnosis to get, an incredibly charged and stigmatized diagnosis to get. And it can still be terrifying, right? Because people may not necessarily know about the modern medical advances. So when they get that diagnosis and they reach out to me, I think the first thing that I always say is that HIV has changed. It's not the same as it was in the 80s. There's so many people living with HIV who are living long, happy, healthy lives.
Yes.
It does need to be managed. You do need to take your medication consistently and daily. But ultimately, what HIV is has changed considerably from what it started off as. And so there needs to be that awareness, though, firstly, of getting tested. I think that's important, for any sexually active person, getting tested regularly. And that's not just HIV, that's other STIs too, gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, etc.
For sure.
And those bacterial ones can be managed with antibiotics. And for something like HIV, it is chronic, it is lifelong, but you can be healthy. And so I think just knowing that and understanding it and understanding what that process entails is important. It's not like other chronic diseases. I always say that it's not like diabetes in the sense that it's so stigmatized. And that's the thing that we need to change. So while you can live this long, happy, healthy life, you will receive stigma. And that's the part that we still need to work on.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. I'd like to know in the comments section what you guys think. Let me know how you feel about where you are in your journey, or anything you'd like to add, to what Krishen has said. Let's get this discussion going. I think it's important in this day and age. We have to bring these type of discussions up to the surface and engage confidently that we are trying to just improve humanity, given that you can't change the past, but we can improve going forward. And I'd like to hear the comments and let me know what your thoughts are. But coming back to your experience, how did you feel when you first heard that you were diagnosed with HIV?
Oh, I was completely devastated. It was a long time ago. It was back in 2009. And that was a point where, yes, medication was available. Yes, it was very different to, just after apartheid or, the kind of late 90s and early 2000s. It was a very different situation. But nonetheless, the stigma was quite terrifying. And also, at the time for me, I had been at UCT and my degree was on the medical campus. So we heard about HIV all the time. So I was totally knowledgeable, totally aware. In fact, in the year before I got diagnosed, I got something like 8 HIV tests and they were all negative.
Wow.
And then I was just going for a routine checkup. It was just bloods being done. I wasn't specifically necessarily just going to check HIV. And that test came back positive, which was quite ironic for me, because at that stage I wasn't as, anxious about it as I was in the past. But you're never really prepared for that moment when it happens. It's something that is life-changing. I always think of it as my life before HIV, being HIV negative, and then my life after contracting HIV and being HIV positive. So you're never fully prepared for it. And you always think about things like, how are you going to share this news with your family? What does it mean for your life? I remember asking the doctor, now it seems silly, but at the time it felt very real. And I was like, am I going to die if I get a cold? Right. So there are these questions that you're really questioning your own mortality and your lifespan and so forth. So in that moment, it's quite devastating. And then for me, what the part that came next, and this is the part that I try and give other people now when I speak to them, is that the knowledge that I was able to develop after that and cultivate and find was really life-saving to me. So one of the first people I got in touch with was a long-term survivor. He'd been living with HIV for about 25 years. And so he was living with HIV long before there were treatments available. He kind of lived through the AIDS crisis. And then by the time I found him and contacted him, he was on medication, but very healthy. And, it was great just to talk to him, because then I was like, oh, okay, so this is manageable. Hearing firsthand from somebody who lived for a quarter of a century with it was incredible. And so, once you deal with that initial devastation, and then you realize that you kind of have to redefine your life on your own terms. And what does that mean? And what does taking responsibility for the diagnosis mean, and managing it? And so for me, I think because I come from the health world, and for me, it should be a fairly straightforward process. And it was in many ways. I started treatment a few months later, and thankfully, I didn't have any side effects from the medication. I've been healthy ever since. And so for me, though, that knowledge, firstly, the access to the knowledge, and then, reaching out to people and a community really was life-changing for me. And it has been subsequently. So now I do HIV activism. I, have a PhD in this field. So that really has been life-changing for me.
Yeah. So my next point was going to come to support and community, because something like that, you probably feel alone, you feel devastated. How do you share something like this to the world? Because it's such a stigmatized topic of discussion. Not so much right now, but at that point in time, you probably felt like your world has ended. Talk us through the emotions that you went through. Just
there's so
from and
many
vulnerability
emotions.
that you experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many emotions. I think the first very strong feeling I had was, how could I have been this stupid? I knew better, so I should have done better. And then you really realize that it's a virus. Don't take it personally. Don't personalize this thing. It's really just a virus. I think we put a lot of moral, we give a lot of
Judgment.
moral weight to something like HIV because it is sexually transmitted, and because sex is still in many of our societies, it's not discussed, and there are taboo aspects to it, and people are repressed and so forth. And so I think there's so many moral aspects to this, whereas in reality, it's just a virus, and you need to do this to manage it, and you do this to keep yourself healthy, and that's a perspective change that I think was incredibly empowering for me. I remember speaking to my sister about it at the time, and she said, if you were in a war zone right now, you could have been hit by a stray bullet.
Yeah.
You live in the country with the highest HIV number of infections in the world. You're a sexually active gay man. Statistically, there was a possibility that you
Chance.
would contract it. And, don't take it as personally. Don't say, oh, does this make me a bad person? Why did I let myself get this? Da, 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 and go down that road. Because I think that the big thing that I've realized is that preserving your mental health is going to be such a huge component of preserving your physical health. We always
Yeah,
just
for
think
sure.
of physical health as separate from mental health. And in my own experience and in the literature, we see that that's not the case, right?
No, for sure.
They both are working together. And if you're able to get mentally into the right place, then you can schedule your doctor's appointments, be adherent to your medication, do all your blood tests, because mentally you're able to do those things, and those things don't feel overwhelming to you. And I think that's the position that I needed to get myself into. And you mentioned the stigma earlier on, and I think it's really important to understand that with HIV, the stigma is not just on an interpersonal level. So it's not just stigma from sexual partners or people that you meet. For HIV, like there's some countries I can't travel to in the world. They've got bans
Right.
on people with
Okay.
HIV entering the country. So, for instance, the first time I traveled to the US, or the second time I traveled to the US, rather, back in 2009, after I got my diagnosis, um, people with HIV were not allowed in the country at that time. That only changed later on when Barack Obama changed that, like a year or two later. But basically, people with HIV could not enter the country, and if they found out that you had HIV, you could be deported, arrested, etc. There were
Wow.
multiple instances of people traveling with their antiretroviral medication getting arrested at airports and so forth. And that still happens in other countries around the world. There's some countries I can't move to. I can't live there because of my HIV status. So I think
Okay.
the stigma that we often think about stigma as like interpersonal, and it's just between two
Personal.
people.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
the stigma with HIV is much broader than that. It's institutionalized. It's legalized. It's quite pervasive in many ways. So there's also coming to terms with that, and that is quite tricky to get around.
Right. Right. That's. I can only imagine what one goes through when your options are limited, but also not your fault at the same point.
Yeah.
At the same time. Yeah, given what's going on now in the current political land space, it's you don't know where you stand.
Exactly.
But I
Absolutely.
commend you for taking such a healthy mindset towards it, because, like you said, mind and physical nature work hand in hand. For me, because when I was having the my anxiety and depressional experience, I know when I'm stressed, I'm anxious person, I lose weight, I lose body weight. I can see
Yeah.
myself going inwards because it's taking a toll. Because my mental side is not functioning as it should. It's not healthy.
Yeah.
It's continuously, looking for an outlet to try and survive. So then my taste palates change, my appetites change, my will to do the things that I love changes. So everything, it's a you know like you have compartments in a train.
Hmm.
Those things start breaking down, but
Exactly.
it's you can build it up back again. That's the
Yeah.
beauty of it. You're not stuck
Yeah.
in that state for too long, but
Yeah.
it's how you perceive that challenge, and willing to work through that tunnel and come to the light and say, okay, I've done the dirty work. Now it's just about managing it going forward. And like with your condition, it's just part of you now. It's who you are, and you
Yeah.
embrace it with full heartedness. And that's that's the kind of message we try to get across during these discussions. Is nothing lasts forever. You can be healthy until your last breath, but it's all comes down to mindset.
Well, I think so. I think that's a great way of putting it, and I think for me, it's mindset and my ability to control what's happening with me mentally and emotionally and so forth. But then I also, because I've studied public health, I also view it much more broadly than just at the individual level. I also look at it structurally and say, well, what is happening structurally? There's discrimination against people living with HIV. People living with HIV can't get employed as easily. There are all of these laws against people living with HIV. So then, yes, it's about changing the mindset. And I think that's more at the individual level. But then it's also about saying, well, what can we do about those structural issues that are making the lives of people with HIV much more difficult than they need to be? And so I guess, once I figured out my own health and I felt empowered for me, and I was able to speak out about living with HIV, I was like, well, how do I change those other things? And that's partly why I did the PhD in public health, because for
Okay.
me, it can't just stop at me. Really, I feel like it's important for me to say, well, what's next, and how do we make life easier for other people as well?
So funny that you say that. I think I have a similar mindset, or the way of looking at life is I took my experience and try and help somebody else, or try and bring a broader awareness to the fact that we all need help
Yeah,
in a way, and it's not just about me. And I feel like the
absolutely.
similar thing with you is that you didn't think about it just as your problem. You embraced it. You sat with it. You worked through it, and then there's a moment in time when you felt, okay, this is what I need to do for the broader community. And that's commendable. That's activism. Um, that's grow death mindfulness right there, because you're
Thank
not
you.
just looking at yourself as an entity. You're looking at it, how can I help humanity in this respect?
Yeah, I remember I had quite a life changing moment shortly after I'd moved to London to do my master's degree. I had joined this group on campus called Youth Stop AIDS, and they do protests on campus and demonstrations, drawing attention to HIV globally. And I had spent some time with them. We did a big weekend in Glasgow and so forth. And then I remember one of the Youth Stop AIDS members saying, well, the biggest event we have is our speaker tour, where we've got young people from all across the UK who speak about living with HIV. And it's really influential because we go to all of these campuses around the country, speak to young people, remind them that HIV is not over, AIDS is not over, our struggle's not over. We still need funding from places like the UK, etc., etc. So it's really about creating awareness. And up until that point, I had only disclosed to a few people in my life, like family members, friends.
Yeah.
Um, and I kind of thought, well, is this something for me, or do I want to keep my story private and to myself? Or is this something that I do? Is this a leap that I take?
And there was a bit of back and forth between that, because I knew that once it's out there, you can't take it back, right? Especially because this was going to be like going on the BBC and speaking at Parliament in the UK and campuses across the country. So, and there's lots of media attention given to this tour. So I knew that once I did that, there's no way to take that back. And so there was a bit of debating and a bit of back and forth internally. And then I realized that my story is only as beneficial in that it can help other people. If my story ends with me, it's just one person's narrative. It's just one story.
Yeah.
But if I can take my story and share it with people in a way that just gets them thinking, gets them maybe testing for HIV, gets them understanding concepts like U equals U, like I explained to you, then I'm taking something and I'm taking my story and I'm doing something with it. And so for me, that was quite a life-changing moment, because I realized that my struggles, yes, I'm brave for living through them, but for me, it was important to take that bravery and help other people. And I'm not saying that that's for everybody. I know many people who would absolutely hate the idea of even coming onto a podcast and, you know, speaking about the HIV or their mental health struggles or whatever.
Anything,
but it was something that I wanted to do, and I'm happy that I did it. And for me, whatever negative side effects I've had from that were totally worth it. Whatever, you know, risks I've taken were totally worth it, because I know that it's been helpful to many people because they've come back to me and told me. And that's really great. And I'm sure you feel the same way with the podcast, where just speaking about what you do with your mental health, you know that sharing that does impact other people.
Oh, it's also it's therapy for me as well. Because for me, I struggle with voicing my feelings or how I express myself. I was very internalized as a person, as a young person. I kept everything on my chest, never vocalized anything that I was going through, because I was like, nah, it's not a big deal. I don't really need to, divulge what I'm going through in the world. It's not important. But then after I went through a moment where I was hospitalized, and in that space, because you live with other people going through similar experiences with you, and you see what they're going through, you just, people watch basically, and you kind of like have that moment of, okay, I need to do better. I need to do something. I can't keep quiet all the time. It's not healthy for me, because it affects my physical state of mind. I mean, my physical state and my mind at the same time. And I knew it's not healthy. Hence why an advocate for voicing how you feel is so important, especially from a male perspective, coming from our societies. I'm not talking from a broader perspective. I'm just talking from an isolated, from an Indian household. It's very difficult for us males from the Indian household to express how we feel without feeling that we're doing something wrong, because we have certain narratives or that we need to uphold, in our homes, which I think now is important for us. It's an important time for us to break down those certain practices and make it feel as if though we're not moving backwards. Yes, we need to go backwards to move forward. Hence why I think we're kind of in the middle of that journey, where we now breaking down the foundations that we thought were normal, which weren't normal. So we're now building new foundations so that the next generation can live a much more expressive lifestyle in terms of how they feel, not just from a cultural perspective.
Well, I love that you've picked up on this, because I think it's a really important point, because I know in the family, society, culture that I've been raised in, there was very much the notion of whatever challenges you're going through, you manage those privately, whether those are physical or mental health challenges or something's happening within the family, you don't speak about that, you manage that privately. And certainly from a masculine perspective, there was also very much the notion of, you don't speak about things, you kind of manage them, you get through them. And there was also these notions of you don't kind of air your dirty laundry, because it was almost as though it was shameful to have an illness, whether that's mental or physical, it was as though it was a weakness. And the thing that I've come to is I don't see it as a weakness anymore, and I don't see it as something shameful. So for me, that's been empowering, because it's been about, firstly, as you were saying in the beginning, owning the truth of something, right? And that doesn't mean I have to share it all the time. It doesn't mean I have to share it if I don't want to, but it does mean that when I choose to, I can own that truth and I can speak about it, because it is my truth to own.
Yeah.
And secondly, now I refuse to feel ashamed about sharing that truth. I think, to go back to your point about some of what we've grown up with culturally, there is quite a lot of shame, and I guess I've rejected that notion, and I think even my family, if I were to be honest, they were quite surprised. I mean, I kind of went from
For
telling
sure.
very few people about my HIV status, and then suddenly I'm on the BBC, speaking to millions of
Your
people around the
family.
world. And so I think they were a bit like taken aback, but I think they also realized that, to go back to your other point, that it was healing for me. So that visibility was good for me, because it took the shame away from it. And then if that can help other people, then that really becomes, it becomes powerful in its own way, because firstly, we're not allowing our narratives to shame us as people, but more than that, we're actually empowering other people to share their stories, if they choose to do so, or at least even acknowledge their stories, even if they just do it internally, right? And own that truth.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break. Yeah, the journey is about just accepting that what has happened to you is okay. It's normal. You're not. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing that's going to stop you from living your best life, whether you choose to or not. I say this because I've had a couple of friends who have taken their lives recently.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
No, thank you. I'm a big advocate now of just trying to make our friends and our colleagues aware that there is ways to deal with certain things in life. And I feel, hence I come back to my point where we keep things on our chest. And I felt a couple of people that I've lost is they held on to something that was very dear and very hard to share. And it just consumed them internally. And they felt like there was no way out. Actually planned their death to a T. And suddenly next minute just, gone.
Oh,
I mean,
goodness.
I was myself there at one point in time, not as extensively in that way, but I had thoughts. I was just mindfully sitting and thinking, if I wasn't here, probably all my troubles would be over. But it doesn't work like that. We believe in the spiritual planes, the karmic reincarnations. You come back, you redo it again.
Yeah.
So we had a choice, and thankfully, my wife was, didn't understand what I was going through at the time, but very supporting. Guided me through certain things to start bringing me back to health. And one thing is always about speaking your truth, because there's always an infinity loop that you go through when you start a journey. And if you kind of like play it down, or you lie or say something else, it just keeps coming back, full circle. But if you stop the rot at the source, you begin to heal nicely. Or not nicely, but you begin your journey.
Yeah, I think something I'd like, and thank you for sharing that. I think something I'd like to add to that is, I think we also need to really recognize that we can't always put all the pressure on the individual. I think this is really important, because to hear what some of your friends were going through, what you've gone through, and what I know so many other people go through, oftentimes I think we have this notion that they need to dig themselves out of that hole. And I think part of that, absolutely, yes, there's going to be that desire to live and that desire to be healthy and so forth. But I also think socially and structurally, we need to look at, why are people's mental health so bad that they are having suicidal ideation in the first place? Why are there not supports in place to help these people when they need it? Because I must say, I tend to think of suicide more as a failure of society versus a failure of the individual. And
Yes.
the reason really for me is because I've worked in, like I said to you, various environments, right? And if I, for instance, had a child in a wheelchair and a school didn't have ramps, that was the failure of the school, and the child was not able to navigate that space because they weren't prepared for that child. There was, for me, putting the blame on the child because they're in a wheelchair makes no sense. Instead, you should have ramps in the school so that that child can navigate the school. Because once they're able to navigate that school, they do really well and they adapt really well. And I think, we don't often think of mental health like that, but I think we should, because there are many people walking around with mental health issues, and it might not be as severe as suicidal ideation or planning or attempts, but there are many people who have mental health issues, just like many people have physical health issues. And I think from a societal point of view, we need to think about what are the ramps that we're putting in place from a mental health point of view. Because to me, if we're getting to that emergency point, then society has in some way failed that person.
Yeah. Similar to how we exercise our physical body. We want to look a certain way aesthetically. We need to do that for our brain as well. We need to give our brain a six-pack, or the muscle that we want it to have. And it's going to break down, it's going to tear, but that's all it's part of growth. And like you said, you beautifully described it as when you put a ramp in, you give that person in the wheelchair the best chance to succeed.
Absolutely.
And I feel that's so important. It's such a simple yet powerful way of describing it, because you give somebody the tools or the way of progressing, and they won't make excuses about it. And only after that, if there is those resources available and you don't do something about it, then we have to look at the individual. You know what I'm saying?
And it's like you're using the example of physical health and saying how we work on our bodies. But if there were no gyms, or the gyms weren't easily accessible, then you're going to have lots less people working on their body. That's just a simple fact. That's something we know from the health research. In fact, we know things like, for instance, the closer a gym is to your home, the more accessible the gym is, the quicker it is to get there, etc. All of those factors play a role in whether you're going to go to the gym or not. So it's not just about your internal motivation to look hot and have the six-pack. It's also about structurally what's happening in society that is enabling you to do that. There was a period in the 80s where only bodybuilders went to gyms, and there were these weird places where guys were pumping iron. And now they're widespread and everybody does it because we have so many of them. It's everywhere now. And people are aware of the fact that they should be going to gym, right? Whereas in the 80s, it was only those bodybuilder guys who went to gym. So societally, we also need to understand that it's not just about that internal motivation or desire. It's also like, are the services available? Are the supports available that you need? And I think, oftentimes when we think about, like, for instance, accessibility, people think that it's going to take something away. It doesn't take anything away. Like, walking people can also use ramps if they wanted to, or they could just use the stairs. It doesn't matter. The ramps don't in any way affect their lives.
The option is there.
The option is there. I mean, I often use the example of subtitles on Netflix. I have normal hearing, but and I'm a first language English speaker, but I'll be often watching something in English and I'll put the subtitles on just because it's easier sometimes, because I don't catch everything. Sometimes there's an accent, etc. Those subtitles are actually helping me too. So I think we need to, and yet they were never intended for me, right? So I think we need to think about it a little bit more broadly, especially when it comes to mental health. We need to think about, like, what is mental health first aid? What does that look like? What do things like empathy and compassion and so forth look like in practice? How do we do mental health first aid? And I think we do need to move away of seeing any mental health conditions as a weakness or a failure of the individual.
Yeah. I mean, given now that in most corporate companies, they do have mental health resources available. You pick up the phone, it's toll free, call it anytime, anonymously. There's no personal information divulged unless the only ones, the back and forth conversation between you and the consultant on the other side. So there are resources now available openly to you. I mean, anonymously also. You don't have to divulge that you're going through something. You can deal with it in a private space, and that's okay. Not everybody wants to share their stories or their healing journeys, and that's okay too. We have to respect that part of it.
Absolutely.
and not force it out of them, so to speak. But the advocacy is there, which I want to ask you is, when you started sharing your journey with the broader public, especially in the UK, how did that feel when you were on that stage and sharing your journey? How was it received?
Initially, it was quite terrifying. I mean, you know, to be that vulnerable and speak about such an intimate aspect of my life with total strangers, and sometimes in quite formal settings. But I was very warmly received, and you know, I would have students at universities come up to me after a talk and say, "Oh, I'd never heard of PrEP, which is HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. It's something an HIV negative person can take to prevent getting HIV." So they'd come up to me and they'd say, "I've never heard of PrEP before, but now that I've know about it, I'd love to, you know, go on it." Or I didn't know that I should be getting tested for HIV. I thought that HIV didn't happen anymore, you know. And so, and then that kind of built my confidence as I went along. Yeah, it was overall an incredibly positive experience. And I think as you share your story more and you see how people respond to it, you certainly feel braver. And that's not to say that I didn't get a few negative responses. With some media appearances, you know, I would get one or two negative responses, but overall, you kind of tune that out as noise and you focus on what your goal is. And it does get easier the more you do it, for sure. It absolutely does. And yeah, I think overall, I wouldn't take any of it back. It was a great experience. And it's continued to be. So I didn't like just stop talking about my HIV status there. Up until now, I've kept doing it. And it's been quite consistent aspect of my life. Yeah, and it's been great.
And going on the BBC in front of a live audience, how did that feel?
Oh gosh, that was and that was on World AIDS Day, so it was like all charged, all like, you know, everything was going on, everything was very HIV specific. And live television interviews can be really daunting, you know, because you just have one take basically, and
one take,
and it was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. It was great. You know, it's really nice to when the media is giving it that level of attention. And also for me, what was really important was being a representative of South Africa, especially because we have the highest number of people living with HIV. So for me, my voice was really important in that space because I wasn't really just speaking about my own story. I was speaking on behalf of my country and 8 million people living with HIV. And so for me, that becomes much bigger. And yeah, it was fantastic. But then also at the same time, I have campaign messaging that I want to get in there. I've got some medical facts that I want to get in there. You know, it's quite tense and quite charged because there's so much to get in there. And, you know, I see myself as representing South Africa essentially on the international stage, and 8 million people living with HIV in South Africa. So, you know, that definitely has its pressures. But nonetheless, it's exhilarating, and it was a really wonderful experience. And it was a very well-received interview. So it was really, really great to do.
And the exposure that you gained after that, you know, in terms of advocacy, did people reach out to you knowing that, okay, you know, they know this about you?
Yeah, loads of people reached out to me, especially people newly diagnosed with HIV, but then also people just saying that, you know, for lots of people, it was really interesting that there was this kind of notion of HIV as, you know, being this thing of the past, and or people kind of just saw it as like this thing of the past that didn't happen anymore, or people still had this notion of that if somebody gets HIV, the person's going to die of AIDS, you know. And there wasn't really much nuance to that. And so a lot of the feedback was really interesting just to see people's misconceptions, I guess, that have been so persistent over 4 decades of HIV. So that was fascinating. And it continued. So I also then did a North American tour, a North American speaking tour, did a few campus appearances and media appearances there. So it continued from there, which was really great, actually.
Oh, that's amazing. And anything in South Africa similar to that experience that you've done?
So I've done some media appearances in South Africa, and I've done some talks in South Africa. So that's been really great as well. Because I haven't actually lived in South Africa for long periods in between those two times, because I was in the UK, then moved to the US for my PhD. I haven't done as much in South Africa, but I have done a few appearances in South Africa as well.
It would be amazing if you could share those resource links with me. I can add it to the description, and if anybody is looking to view it after or during the podcast, it will be in the description below. So check out Krishen's experiences, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to him. But from a day-to-day living perspective now, how does your day look like? How do you manage and navigate life now?
Do you mean specifically in relation to my HIV or more generally?
No, just generally, like your mental health, wellness. How do you keep going?
Well, a big part of my life now is staying healthy. I mean, I guess it's one of the side effects of having a PhD in health behavior. You're quite focused on health and staying healthy, and you have read all the literature on health. So, but so just at an individual level, I train daily. I think you had my personal trainer, Candice de Medonza, on. So she's wonderful.
That's a non-negotiable.
Yes, exactly. So I train daily. I try and eat as healthily as possible, without becoming obsessive about it. I think we can also sometimes take the pursuit of health to the point where it becomes its own obsession. And so I try not to do that. I think it's important to also relax and enjoy life. I meditate every day. I do breath work every day. So I'm not at all religious, but I'm quite spiritual. So those kinds of practices have become important to me. Various types of yoga, including breath work, and so those practices have been very good in the sense that they're quite grounding for me. And it's nice to kind of have that connection to. I'm half Indian, so it's nice to have that connection to my actual ancestry and heritage. Through spiritual practices. That's important, especially because I'm not religious. So it's nice to have that. And then I recently started my own consultancy, Equidiverse Synergy. And it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy. We also do educational consulting and specialized research services. So we do quite a lot, but it kind of brings together all of my areas of expertise and my journey, my experience, both lived experience and academic and research experience. And it kind of just brings them all into one melting pot, which is quite fun for me. So that's been really exciting and been taking up all of my time, really. I think that after I completed my PhD, I'd always thought that I, was going to become a professor, and that's what I was going to do. And that was it. So I always thought, okay, going to do my PhD, and then I'm just going to be a researcher and professor and mainly focus on teaching because I really love teaching. And then after finishing it, and I got to teach both during my master's and during my PhD. So, and I've taught at both undergraduate and graduate levels, and I still love it and it's great for me. But I've realized that I needed to step away from academic work and the academic world and kind of be a bit more grounded in the real world. And I think I'll eventually find my way back to the academic world. But for now, I'm kind of enjoying trying different things. For many people with a PhD, it becomes quite limiting because there's so few of us, and you kind of become you have tunnel vision in terms of, I'm going to be an academic, I'm going to be a researcher, I'm going to get published in all of these journals, And for me, not to say that wasn't important, but I wanted to kind of say, well, what else could I do? So that's where I'm at the moment, which has been quite fun to get here, I will say.
Isn't it amazing how the universe, guides you onto different paths when you need it? It's because we have such a profound way of living that we think this is the only way, or this is what we want to achieve, and this is the only thing that we want to do in life. And then life hits you, and then you get redirected onto another path, and you can walk that path and walk it, see if it works for you. Okay, doesn't work for you, go on to another path. And I think that's where flexibility comes into play when we in terms of our mental health as well. Because we for myself, I always try to be perfect or try to succeed in everything I do. Coming from that sporting environment where you want to excel and perform at a high level, continuously win. Seriously, I'm a winner. I hate losing. It's something but now I take it as a lesson. When your losses, you learn something and then take that forward into, so you have less of the losses and more of the wins going forward. But there will be losses, throughout your life. It's not that you're failing at anything. It's just that you're trying new things, and if it doesn't work, that's okay. And yes, Candace, if you're listening, I've got Krishen admitting he does work out every day. So you can't get away.
No, Dave, not if I try.
With her.
I'm so dedicated. Like I almost never miss a session. She'll tell you I'm like one of her most dedicated clients. But I've also, just to your point, I've tried to not even define it as failures anymore. I think we do get so stuck in what is society's definition of success and how are we going to try and match up to that. And I think that's great if you do, and that's wonderful. But I also think that sometimes it's about saying, what is success for me? And what does that look like for me? And, for me, there's been recreating myself, reimagining my life, breaking it all down and building it all up again and trying things, in different ways. So for me, that's never been a failure. That's always been we get to do this another time. We get to have another go round. And I love that. So I love the idea of challenging myself and seeing if I can do it. When I moved to the US to do my PhD, I sold my apartment. I loved my job. I loved what I was doing, but I was ready to move on, so I had a great job. I was a clinician. That's what I done my first degree for. It's what I loved doing. But then it was time to move on. And for me, yes, there was a sense of maybe a bit of loss of your old life, but then there's also, well, what's next?
Yeah.
And so then, and that in and of itself becomes its own journey,
Yeah. I always remember that scene in Harry Potter when, the old phoenix dies and the new one rises from the ashes. It's like that.
Yes. Oh my God, I love Harry Potter. So yes, absolutely. Exactly. Yeah,
I'm sure
it's
you
very
visited in Scotland when you went.
Oh, I didn't. And I'm so sad that I didn't, which means that I have to go back.
Oh, no? No, you should.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely have to go back. I love Harry Potter. So yeah, I love the kind of image of the phoenix, because I think in many ways that has been what my life has been about. It's about redefining, recreating, reimagining, and getting an opportunity to try something new and try something different. And so, and that's not to say that doesn't come with its challenges. It absolutely does. Like I'm sure you can attest to, like, moving overseas, for instance, is quite intense. It's quite like a cultural shift, and it's quite hectic, and you really have to adapt to a new life in a new country and new people and new ways of doing things. But it's also exhilarating and thrilling, and you learn so much about yourself in that process too.
Yeah, resilience is a word that comes to mind when it comes to those kind of experiences. You learn to unlearn a lot of the things that weren't working and learn new things about yourself. And it's, some things work, some things don't. You got to take it with a pinch of salt, but you also have to be kind to yourself. That's the one thing I always tell people. You got to be kind to yourself and give yourself a break, because it's not going to be perfect. It's not what you envision it to be.
Yes.
It's always different. Always different. And you got to navigate those challenges. And, hopefully thankfully for me, my wife and I had each other to support on. And I can only imagine what somebody alone goes through it. I've had a couple of friends who were embarked on the journey alone, and they don't really have that kind of spousal support or that partner support, which can be very difficult. And you start questioning a lot whether I made the right decision. Do I go back? Do I stay? Do I stick it out? What do I do? And hence why we need to be vocal about how we feel and not keep it internalized, because you might know somebody might give you perspective and change your mindset in an instant.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love what you say about not romanticizing it or not like buying into the fairy tale of it, and instead accepting the reality of what it is. Because I think when you're willing to say, hey, I've made the sacrifice, I'm going to have a new experience. There's going to be some good and some bad in it. And you're not overly idealistic and overly romantic about it. Then I think you actually are more prepared for whatever challenges come your way. Because absolutely, to your point, it's definitely not easy. And as a single person, oh my gosh, just like, because you can only rely on yourself. So you're navigating all of this by yourself. And it's just like, I've done it twice now. And I'm like, yeah, I would have loved to have had a spouse to have done it with, to be honest with you.
No, it does help. It does. It really helps.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. No, before we wind down the podcast, just a bit of a closing reflection is on what does humanity in health mean to you? Where do you see us as humanity now in current state of affairs?
So I think humanity in health, I think what that really means to me is firstly, understanding that health is not a privilege. Health is a right. And everybody should have access to those resources that enable them to live a healthy life. And so for me, the humanity needs to start with a sense of equity. Because without that, really, we're going to struggle to find the humanity in health. If we just think of health as a commodity for the privileged few, then I think we're losing sight of what it should be, really. And for me, from my academic background, for me, what that means is attending to disparities, like racial disparities, attending to those kinds of disparities is going to get us closer to humanity in health, because we can't really just speak about health as though everybody has an equal chance at it or everybody has an equal opportunity at it, because they don't. And so once we start understanding what those barriers are and how we can get closer to equity and accessibility, then I think we're moving closer towards humanity in health. Without that acknowledgement, we're kind of shooting in the dark, and we're not really acknowledging what many people go through on a daily basis. Because our starting points are not the same. And that's crucial to understand. If you live in the southern US as a black man, a black gay man, you've got about a 50% chance of contracting HIV in your lifetime. That is not the same as somebody else of a different racial background or a different sexuality background. And so it's really important to understand that because our starting points are not the same, we're going to need different types of supports. We're going to need access to different resources in order for the end result to be the same of healthy populations, healthy societies, healthy countries, a healthy world. We need to give different supports based on people's needs. And that becomes really important.
Yeah, we need good leaders as well to drive this, open-minded leaders, compassionate, empathic leaders, but also very strong in driving it.
Absolutely.
Because I feel now we kind of like in the middle of that. We don't really have leaders who actually are brave enough to step out of their ego self to look at humanity in a broader perspective.
Yeah, and I think leaders that are willing to disrupt the status quo, I think it's really important to say, well, if we're only looking at maintaining the comfort levels and the health of a few privileged people at the top of the hierarchy, and we're not willing to disrupt that status quo to give health benefits to larger parts of the population, whether that is a universal healthcare, like a national health insurance, or whatever that looks like, it's really important to disrupt the status quo to get there. And I think often people like things the way they are if they're comfortable with it, and if the system benefits them, and they're not willing to enjoy any changes that might give them a bit of discomfort, but might actually give us a completely reimagined future. And I think, if the privileged few have to go through a bit of discomfort to get to a point where more people have access to resources, I think that's something that we need to be talking about more.
Yeah. I mean, the few that are privileged up there, have to go to the ground, spend time on the ground and see how it is for everyday people who don't have the resources available, who are scrapping for any type of support that they can get. And then like when you live in an experience, you understand it. If you look at it from an outside perspective, it's very different. So it's important that we all get together in terms of understanding each other's environment to be a bit more understanding of it. So but we can all have hopes and dreams, and we hope that that's part of it.
Absolutely.
But Dr. Krishen, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Such an insightful conversation, sharing your journey with us openly and honestly. I've learned a lot, so thank you so much for also educating me on certain things. And I hope the listeners have taken something from it as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
The best for you in your ventures. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful chatting to you today. And I hope the conversation was beneficial for the listeners too. It's been wonderful chatting.
Thank you so much. Yes, guys, remember to hit that subscribe, like, and follow buttons. Put on the notification bells for the next episode. If you want to leave a comment, please do so. It will just help the channel grow. And until the next one, everyone, stay zen. Thank you so much.